1917 to 2017. The last century has seen much change. Many aspects of life and entertainment have adapted along with people's views of them. Take music. So many genres, so many types, so many variants. Just one of those is rock. Rock music has had a much-loved history with so much to talk about. Let's use this as a way to explore how times have changed. Rock music first started in the USA in the 40s. At this time it was not a coherent genre but the beginning of its development. It started with people making mixes and changes to music types like blues and country music, with influences from folk and jazz. By the 50s, the first real examples of rock music started to emerge with people like Bill Haley and the Comets, with songs of theirs like Rock Around the Clock. At this point, this new genre was given the name rock and roll, or rock and roll. In the 50s also, there was the emergence of the first real rock star, Elvis Presley. He was responsible for a number of iconic songs, including Jailhouse Rock and Blue Suede Shoes. Presley's songs and persona arguably helped the defining of a growing American culture of teen spirit that was not present until this time. In the 60s, rock had now become massive, and a number of hybrid subgenres had emerged, like folk rock, jazz rock, and other subgenres, including heavy metal, progressive rock, and glam rock. Punk rock also starts here, but doesn't fully emerge until the 70s. The 60s period is commonly referred to as the classic rock era. It saw the emergence of the swinging 60s and more bands beginning to establish a rock ethic. The Beatles were, and arguably still to this day, are the biggest rock band ever. They started with a light pop sound on tracks like Love Me Do and She Loves You, before developing their rock sound over subsequent years in more artistic and progressive forms, most notably on the Sgt. Pepper album. The emergence of the Beatles can be seen as the start of a progressive shift in which British rock bands would dominate. Some rock artists made an impact at the Woodstock Festival, 15th to 18th of August 1969. This three-day festival attracted over 400,000 people and included bands like the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and emerging British band The Who. The 70s was defined by supergroups that achieved worldwide acclaim, like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and as previously mentioned, The Who. The first two of these bands created a harder edge sound than had previously been the case, along with a stage act that included elongated jam sessions of progressive rock music involving band members playing off each other beyond their recorded song structures. In the later 70s, a rebellion amongst the young at the time rejected these dinosaur rock acts in favor of a sharper, shorter, aggressive sound that spawned punk music. Rock didn't disappear though, but rather reinvented itself with its own aggressive guitar-driven sound in this time. And again, the UK led the way with the new wave of British heavy metal, NWOBHM. Jeff Barton, editor at the time of Sounds Rock magazine, coined this expression for this music scene that included bands like Iron Maiden, Saxon, and Motorhead, that went on to have big success particularly in the 80s and proved to have a longevity through to the present day too. The early 80s in rock came to be defined by and dominated by hair metal and ore bands, best illustrated by Bon Jovi and Journey respectively. This music was melodic, with sing-along choruses and particularly with hair metal by a glam, pretty boy look, perfectly coiffured hair, and overall a look not dissimilar to glamorous girls. It was a very American culture that impacted the UK too. Alongside this melodic rock music genre, another style developed and became as successful, namely the thrash metal movement. It grew out of the UK new wave of British heavy metal movement, with its fast beats, aggressive style, and raspy vocals. The leading bands in this genre initially were the four American bands Anthrax, Megadeth, Slayer, and Metallica. Towards the mid-end of the decade and into the 90s, another rebellion to this established rock order took over, similar to the backlash of the 70s. This was grunge rock music. It was associated with a look and music vastly different to hair metal. It was a dirty, unkempt look and appealed to teenagers who couldn't or didn't want to go for the made-up look that preceded it. Nirvana was the band typifying this movement, establishing themselves in the Seattle NW America grunge scene. Their Smells Like Teen Spirit single from the Nevermind album became a huge hit for the band across the world, including the UK. In the 2000s, no specific style or genre particularly dominated. Instead, there was the emergence of a lot more subgenres. These subgenres included, for example, emo, nu metal, post-grunge, and post-Brit pop. Bands included White Stripes, The Killers, and My Chemical Romance. This splintering of styles continued through the 2010s decade as we are today. Encouraged by the ease of access through the internet, particularly YouTube, for rock fans to find alternative rock music bands and styles. This now gives us an opportunity to briefly talk about how the way in which people access and enjoy music has changed. At one point in time, music was only heard on the radio, or possibly live at a restaurant, casino, or other special event. But that has since changed. A very popular choice that is still strong today is live concerts. Multiple bands, artists playing at a gig, or just one band or artist to themselves, in front of a large audience, sometimes at an outdoor stage. Buying and owning music has progressed as well, from vinyl records, which have seemingly made a comeback, to cassette tapes, to CDs, to nowadays where we are digitally downloading from the internet. Today, the majority of people experience their music through YouTube. Music videos on the site have hundreds of millions of views, as it is free, easy to access, and a popular platform to use. Now, I could sit here all day and tell you facts about rock, but what about people's actual thoughts on the topic? I presented people in my local area with this questionnaire for them to answer, and these are the results. There is still one more thing I'd like to show you. I myself am a huge fan of rock music, as a whole. And the reason for that is because my dad is a massive fan too. So I just grew up with this naturally. As you can see, he has a history with collecting rock music. This is just a fraction of what he owns. And now, to tell you about his history with rock, here is my dad himself.
Well, I can probably trace it back to when I was 14 years old. I had a friend at school called Roger Raven, who I remember I went round to Roger's one day, just in the holidays, and he showed me some of his music collection. And I can remember exactly the bands that he talked to me about and showed me about and played me some music. It was AC/DC's High Voltage and Black Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath albums. And I have to say, it totally blew my mind. Up until that time, I'd listened to a bit of pop music. I liked a bit of Blondie, as most teenagers did at my age. But this was the first time I really heard some rock music in a form that I hadn't really heard before. Roger also told me about a show on Radio 1 at the time called The Friday Rock Show. And that was the DJ who did that programme was a chap called Tommy Vance. And from that week onwards, Friday night, 10 o'clock through to midnight, I listened to the Friday Rock Show with Tommy Vance. So yep, that's what got me into rock music. I guess the thing for me about rock music is that it is its energy and its power. So a lot of the rock music I like particularly is the driving, energetic sort of rock music. Although it's not by any means all of what rock music is all about. But for me, yes, that energy is something that I really took to. I've always had quite an energetic outdoor sort of way of life, doing lots of sport, and music really helped me in some of things like, for example, going to the gym. And at the time, certainly into the 80s, I think I'm right in saying this, it was the time of something called the Sony Walkman, which enabled you to go around and do things with music clipped to your ears in a Sony Walkman, which was fantastic at the time. And for me to be able to do my sport with that in my ears was great. So that was why I enjoy it so much. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the main reasons. I also find the music helps to inspire me. So I tend to spend a lot of time on the road, in the car and on the trains, and I find it helps to give me thoughts and ideas about things. Other things it does, it also can help reflect the mood that I have. So as I said, it's not all about driving music. A lot of the rock music I like is a little bit slower paced, more reflective. Bands like the Eagles, for example, that's some of their music, and other bands of a similar ilk has a lot of sort of mood type music and helps reflect a sort of more slower pace. But yeah, I guess that's why I like rock music. Well, I guess I've got quite an eclectic rock music taste. I like rock music from most decades over the last 50 years. From the 70s, bands like Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, Status Quo. These are the bands I got into in the early days. Through the 80s, with bands like Bon Jovi, Poison, Van Halen. And in the 80s, that was more the sort of hair metal music genres at the time. I like some of the grunge stuff in the 90s, but I didn't really get into that in a big way. I like some of the thrash metal stuff, some of the major bands like Metallica, but again, not in a big way. But the main music type I guess I like and listen to most today is something called AOR, which stands for Adult Orientated Rock. It's a more melodic type of rock that was typified by bands in the 80s, bands like Journey and Boston. Although now there's lots of newer bands still purveying that type of music today. Bands like Brother Far Tribe, Alan Lander, purveying a similar type of AOR rock, melodic type rock music, and it's that genre I probably like the best. I guess I've just named some of them, but my favourite band is probably a band called Thunder, who had its origins back in the 80s when I was actually probably back late 70s, early 80s. I remember I saw them in a previous incarnation when they were called Terraplane. They were bottom of the bill at something called the Reading Rock Festival, which I gather is still going on today, although it's called Reading Festival. But it was a 3-day rock music festival at that time, and they were bottom of the bill on a Sunday afternoon, and I thought they were fantastic. So I followed them through the next 5 or 6 years. They eventually imploded, as many bands do, but they energized and reformed into a band called Thunder, and they are still going to this day. And I've got all of their albums, and I really like their music. I also like, from the 70s, a band called Deep Purple, probably one of my favourite original hard rocking bands. But I have many bands of the current day that I also like, whose names and artists, the people in the bands, I probably don't know too much of these days as I knew more of in the 70s and 80s, but I like the type of music that they play. Well, rock's gone through a number of incarnations over the last 70, 80 years. Obviously, I wasn't around in the 50s and stuff with Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley and stuff, through the 60s, sort of swinging 60s, psychedelic 60s and stuff. 70s are the hard rock super group eras of the Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple. And for me, I think what's happened now is that those big bands have now morphed into lots of smaller bands in different musical genres, which I think is good, because it means that some people, particularly through the internet and YouTube and things like that, can now see and experience more bands certainly than I was aware of when I was growing up. There's been a lot more, as I say, splintering into different genres, so thrash metal, new metal, death metal, goth metal, hair metal music, all these different genres. But I think, summing it up, I think Lemmy from Motorhead summed it up best. He said, "It's just rock and roll, mate." It summed it up for me. Key moments in rock music, probably have to start with Woodstock, which was the main huge event that was put together, which had huge numbers of bands come together in one form, one place for the same time. That was probably one of the key defining moments in rock. Through, I think, probably to the late 70s in Britain, with the development of a genre called the New Wave of British heavy metal, which is typified by the bands like Iron Maiden, Saxon and Motorhead again. At the time, really brought a new specific driving sort of hard rock music with a more of an edge to it, which was the sort of metal element of it in the late 70s. And for me, that whole genre, the 70s, was a key time. A time when I was really getting into music, as I've described, and rock music at that time, typified and promoted by a magazine called Kerrang, which I subscribed to at that time. And I also had the good fortune to be able to interview the editor, a chap called Jeff Barton, for one of my college projects when I was at university, actually. So for me, that was a really important time, the development of rock music. Yeah, probably the sort of key moments for me. Well, I guess when you're a teenager, you tend to get into one thing or another. The kids these days, it's Xbox and PlayStation, all those stuff like that, and getting special editions of games and things like this. For me at the time, it was getting every version of a record, in LPs and vinyl as it was, which was the main musical medium at that time. And the ways that record companies promoted and sold them merchandise at that stage was through special editions in terms of different coloured vinyl or picture discs, as it were. My collection includes a number of those type of vinyl products at the time. Expensive too. Imported versions of the same products were also part of my collection. So I've got albums I imported from Japan, which cost me something like 20-25 quid at the time, which was probably 70-80 quid in today's money. That, as well as just collecting every album by the bands I was interested in, was something I was really into at the time, to the extent that I think my vinyl collection numbered something like some 350-400 albums, as well as cassettes and tapes, as it was at the time, before morphing into CDs, and I've probably got 150 odd CDs as well. But now almost everything's on the iPod, and I've got an iPod collection which has now got about 8,500 songs on it. So I haven't stopped collecting, but just in a different medium.
So there we have it. A history of rock music, from then to now. It has seen much change and adaptation, but also much staying power, proving its popularity. As I stated at the beginning, music is just one example of this. Over 100 years, and far beyond that, many aspects of life have changed, such as technology, fashion, entertainment, and all of these have had views and ways of presenting themselves changed as well. Who knows how the next 100 years will change?